In 1945, on the 4th day of August, a contingent of Soviet schoolchildren presented the ambassador of the United States with a wooden carving. This replica of the Great Seal of the United States stood close to 2 feet in height. The children, who were members of the Vladimir Lenin All-Union Pioneer Organization, smiled as they offered this gesture of gratitude to America, their wartime ally. Initially, the seal was placed among other diplomatic gifts. However, several months later, a staff member, whose identity remains unknown, decided to affix it to the wall within the ambassador's private study. It was positioned directly behind where Ambassador Harman would conduct the most confidential discussions of the early Cold War era. What Harman could not have known was that concealed within the skillfully carved wood, beneath the eagle's beak, resided one of the most advanced listening devices ever conceived. This technological masterpiece would compromise American diplomatic communications for the subsequent 7 years. The wooden seal hung in the study at Spaso House, the official residence of the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, just as the alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States began its gradual and inescapable deterioration. W. Avril Harriman, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, was a businessman who transitioned into a diplomat. He arrived in Moscow in October of 1943 at President Roosevelt's personal request, with the mission of preserving the delicate cooperation essential for defeating Germany. The residence itself, a neoclassical mansion constructed before the Russian Revolution, had evolved into the central hub of American diplomatic endeavors within the Soviet Union. Its rooms teemed with classified documents, strategic discussions, and a continuous movement of officials traveling between Washington and Moscow. The seal bore witness to it all, situated precisely where every conversation concerning Soviet intentions, American strategy, and the escalating tensions over Eastern Europe would unfold mere inches from its carved surface. Harriman held meetings in that study with military attachés, discussing Soviet troop movements, with State Department officials, debating post-war policies, and with visiting congressmen, endeavoring to grasp Stalin's true objectives. The device concealed within the seal remained inactive during these initial months, awaiting a signal that had not yet been transmitted. Yet its placement was impeccable. The trap was fully prepared. Throughout 1946, as Harriman prepared to depart Moscow and return to Washington, the seal continued to adorn the wall, seamlessly transferred to his successor. The new ambassador, a career diplomat possessing less of Harriman's personal rapport with Stalin, conducted his own sensitive discussions in that same study, entirely unaware that the decorative gift from Soviet children had transformed into something far more insidious. The technology embedded within the seal was revolutionary for its time. It was a passive cavity resonator that necessitated no batteries, no wires, and no internal power source that might be detected by the standard counter-surveillance equipment of that period. It was an invisible phantom, eluding every diagnostic sweep, silently awaiting Soviet operators to direct their illuminating radio signal towards the residence from a nearby building or vehicle. Once this signal reached the device, sound waves from the conversations within the study would cause a thin membrane inside the seal to vibrate, thereby modulating the reflected radio waves back towards Soviet receivers. There, technicians could decode every word spoken within what the Americans believed to be a secure environment. The device had been created by Lev Terman, a Russian inventor whose name would achieve fame in the West for originating the innovative electronic musical instrument that bore his name. However, his true genius had been channeled into more clandestine objectives. After returning to the Soviet Union from the United States in 1938, Terman was apprehended, suspected of offenses against the state, and incarcerated in a sharashka. These were secret Soviet research laboratories where scientists and engineers labored under guard to develop technology for the military and intelligence services. It was within this environment, under the constant threat of execution, that he conceived of a listening device so elegantly simple that it would confound Western intelligence agencies for years following its discovery. The passive resonant cavity required no compromising elements, no radio emissions that could be traced, and no power consumption that could be measured. It existed in a state of complete dormancy until activated externally. And in this dormant state, it was functionally undetectable. By 1947, The Cold War had solidified from wartime suspicion into open antagonism. The study at Spaso House became an even more crucial location for American diplomatic communications. Secretary of State George Marshall himself utilized the room during his visit to Moscow for the Council of Foreign Ministers, preferring its tranquil setting to the busier areas within the embassy building. Marshall, the architect of the plan designed to rebuild Western Europe and contain Soviet expansion, held meetings in that study concerning the future of Germany, the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe, and the escalating American commitment to thwarting communist proliferation wherever it manifested. The seal hung silently on the wall behind him, its concealed device now fully operational. Soviet intelligence officers listened to every word of Marshall's deliberations, acquiring invaluable insights into American strategic thinking at the highest echelons. The intelligence gathered was extraordinary, providing Moscow with advanced knowledge of American negotiation stances, internal disputes regarding Soviet intentions, and the comprehensive scope of discussions pertaining to containment policy as it was being formulated. The Soviets operated the device with meticulous discipline, activating it only when high-value targets were present, thus avoiding any patterns that might attract attention or suspicion. A van would be parked near Spaso House, or operators would work from a nearby building with a clear line of sight to the ambassador's residence, directing their transmitter at the precise location where the seal was displayed. The internal membrane would vibrate with the sound waves of American voices. The cavity would resonate, and the modulated signal would be reflected back to Soviet receivers, where it could be demodulated and recorded. Ambassador after ambassador worked in that study, each conducting the business of American diplomacy while the seal captured every unguarded moment, every candid assessment, and every strategic debate that the State Department believed was taking place in a secure environment. The Americans had begun to suspect Soviet eavesdropping in general terms, operating under the assumption that Moscow routinely monitored foreign diplomats. However, the specific method remained unknown. Standard debugging equipment of the era searched for radio transmissions, electrical currents, and metallic components that might indicate a hidden microphone. The Great Seal bug, being entirely passive and containing only a small antenna and a resonant cavity, produced none of these telltale signatures. It represented a perfect blind spot in American counterintelligence capabilities, a vulnerability that Soviet engineers had identified and exploited with remarkable ingenuity. The initial indication that something might be amiss did not arise from American counterintelligence, but rather from a technological anomaly. In late 1951, a British radio operator monitoring Soviet military air traffic in Moscow detected voices on his receiver. These voices seemed to be emanating from a frequency that should have carried only Russian military communications. The operator, perplexed by this deviation, reported it to his superiors, noting that the conversations appeared to originate from within the British embassy. The diplomatic wireless service conducted an investigation but discovered nothing during their initial scans. The incident was sufficiently puzzling to be shared with their American counterparts, who began to contemplate the possibility of similar compromises within their own facilities. Shortly thereafter, an American signals intelligence officer monitoring military radio frequencies intercepted American voices that appeared to originate from Spaso House, the same unexplained phenomenon of diplomatic conversations bleeding into Soviet military channels. These occurrences prompted a renewed series of debugging efforts in early 1952. These efforts were more thorough than previous routine sweeps, but still relied on conventional detection methods that sought active radio transmitters or electrical signals. Nothing was found during these searches because the investigators were looking for the wrong indicators, presuming that any listening device would require internal power and would transmit continuously, rather than reflecting an external signal when activated. The technology employed by the Soviets was simply too novel, too far removed from the established understanding of what Western counterintelligence expected to be detectable by standard means. The searches concluded with the reassuring but erroneous assessment that the premises were secure, leaving diplomats to continue their work under the false impression that their conversations remained private. Two State Department security officers, John W. Ford and Joseph Bezian, arrived in Moscow in March of 1951, equipped with more advanced apparatus and a distinct approach to the issue. Ford, a seasoned security officer, and Bezian, an electronics technician of Armenian heritage who had joined the State Department following wartime service, understood that the mysterious radio intercepts suggested something unusual, potentially a passive device that only activated when illuminated from an external source. This hypothesis was informed by recent intelligence indicating that Soviet engineers were experimenting with resonant cavity technology, although no functional examples had yet been obtained and analyzed. The individuals conducted inspections of the British and Canadian embassies, as well as American installations, employing signal generators and sensitive receivers. These instruments were calibrated to detect not only outgoing transmissions, but also any alteration of external signals as they passed through the rooms being examined. The investigation progressed systematically through various embassy areas. While no definitive findings were made, persistent detection of unusual radio behavior suggested the presence of sophisticated surveillance. Bezin, who would later earn the moniker the Rug Merchant from his colleagues due to his patient and systematic approach to technical security, formulated a working hypothesis regarding the potential function of a passive device and the signatures it might produce when activated. The primary difficulty was that such a device would be virtually undetectable when not actively activated, rendering passive scanning insufficient for its location. The team recognized the necessity of active testing, which involved generating signals across a range of frequencies while monitoring for any atypical reflections or modulations that might indicate a hidden resonator. This strategy demanded considerable time, patience, and the cooperation of embassy personnel, who would need to engage in extensive testing protocols that might ultimately yield no results. Ambassador George F. Kennan arrived in Moscow in May of 1952 to assume his post, returning to the city where he had previously served and where he had formulated his theories on Soviet behavior that would significantly influence American containment policy. Kennan, by this juncture one of the most influential figures concerning Soviet affairs in Washington, took up residence in Spaso House. He was fully cognizant that Soviet workers had recently completed renovations on the property, a standard practice universally assumed to involve the installation of listening devices. He mandated further security inspections utilizing the most advanced equipment. However, once more, these searches failed to uncover anything conclusive. The apparent normalcy of the residents' activities was almost suspicious in itself, implying either a dramatic shift in Soviet practices or the continued inadequacy of American detection capabilities. The eventual discovery stemmed from a meticulously planned operation in which Kennan himself was instrumental. Joseph Bezin returned to Moscow in September of 1952, this time equipped with a specific protocol designed to test for passive resonant devices. On the 12th of September, as part of a pre-arranged plan, Kennan occupied his desk in the study and commenced reading aloud from a published State Department document. Meanwhile, Bezin, posing as a guest, monitored radio frequencies from another part of the residence. As Kennan proceeded through the text in a steady, unhurried manner, Bezin's sensitive receiver began to pick up modulated signals. The ambassador's words were being reflected back on a microwave frequency. The signal appeared to originate from a location near Kennan's position. As Bezin traversed the study with his equipment, the strongest return signal emanated from the wall where the wooden seal was displayed. What transpired next has been recounted with slight variations in detail across different accounts, yet the fundamental facts remain consistent. Bezin, communicating through gestures and hushed tones, signaled to Kennan that his voice was being transmitted and that he should continue reading. He briefly departed to retrieve John Ford, and the two men meticulously worked around the room, verifying that the signal originated from the vicinity of the Great Seal's mounting. When Bezin removed the wooden carving from the wall, anticipating the device would be concealed within the masonry behind it, the signal abruptly ceased. The realization struck him instantly. The device was not embedded in the wall, but rather within the seal itself. With Kennan continuing his recitation, Bezin opened the wooden seal and uncovered a cylindrical metal object affixed inside. It was positioned beneath the eagle's beak, with minuscule perforations allowing sound to reach a diaphragm. The device was photographed, documented, and carefully extracted from its wooden enclosure. That night, Bezin kept the bug beneath his pillow, concerned that Soviet operatives might attempt to reclaim it before it could be transported to Washington for analysis. This discovery represented both a significant compromise of security and a valuable intelligence opportunity. The Americans now possessed a technology that had evaded detection for 7 years, a device whose operational principles required understanding, replication, and countermeasures. The bug was dispatched to Washington, where it became the focus of intensive scrutiny by the FBI, CIA, Naval Research Laboratory, and British intelligence agencies, who were enlisted to aid in its examination. The device that arrived in Washington perplexed the technical experts tasked with analyzing it. Initially, its apparent simplicity was striking. A small cylindrical chamber with a thin membrane at one end, a quarter-wavelength antenna, and absolutely no electronic components. There were no batteries, no wires, no transistors or vacuum tubes, nothing that conventional understanding would deem essential for a functional listening device. The analysts initially struggled to comprehend its operational mechanism, conducting tests that yielded inconsistent results due to illuminating it at incorrect frequencies or with insufficient power. The breakthrough arrived when a British technician named Peter Wright, employed by the Marconi Company and later a counterintelligence officer for MI5, assumed leadership of the investigation. He successfully operated the device by employing an illuminating frequency of approximately 800 megahertz. Wright's analysis revealed the ingenious simplicity of the design. The chamber functioned as a resonator, precisely dimensioned to respond to specific microwave frequencies. Sound waves from conversations would impinge upon the thin membrane, causing it to vibrate and consequently altering the resonant characteristics of the chamber. When an external radio signal at the correct frequency was directed at the device, these fluctuations in the chamber would modulate the reflected signal, effectively encoding the sound waves onto the returning microwave beam. A receiver tuned to capture this modulated reflection could then decode the audio, enabling remote listening with no trace, except during the brief intervals when the device was actively illuminated. The brilliance of the design lay in its complete passivity. In the absence of the external illuminating signal, the device was merely a piece of metal within a wooden carving, emitting no signals and requiring no power. The implications were profound and disquieting. The FBI determined that the seal also contained evidence of an earlier listening device, a larger chamber that had apparently housed a more conventional battery-powered bug at some point. This suggested that the Soviets had been monitoring the ambassador's study through multiple technological generations. More concerning was the realization that if the Soviets had developed this passive resonator technique, they could have deployed similar devices in embassies and consulates globally, all of them lying dormant and undetectable until activated from proximate locations. An exhaustive review of American facilities in Soviet bloc countries was immediately ordered, utilizing the newfound understanding of passive device signatures to guide more effective searches. The analysis also spurred the rapid development of countermeasures and, more ambitiously, efforts to replicate and enhance the Soviet technology. Wright and his colleagues developed a comparable British system, designated Satan, which was subsequently shared with American, Canadian, and Australian intelligence services for deployment in their operations. The passive resonator concept proved so effective that variations of it would be employed by Western intelligence agencies throughout the 1950s, effectively turning Soviet innovation against its creators. The discovery had, in essence, leveled the playing field, providing Western agencies with both the means to detect these devices and the capability to deploy their own versions. However, the question lingered. How much damage had been inflicted during the 7 years the Great Seal Bug had operated undetected in the ambassador's study? The Americans faced a difficult dilemma regarding how to handle their discovery. The bug represented both a security catastrophe and a potential propaganda opportunity. However, disclosing its existence would signal to the Soviets that their operation had been compromised while simultaneously revealing the extent of American vulnerability. For the time being, the decision was made to keep the discovery classified, sharing information only with close allies and employing the intelligence derived from analyzing the device to enhance security at diplomatic facilities worldwide. Ambassador Kennan continued his duties in Moscow, although his tenure would be prematurely concluded by a diplomatic incident unrelated to the bugging operation. In September of 1952, shortly after the bug's discovery, Kennan casually compared conditions at the ambassador's residence to his experience of internment by the Germans during World War II. This remark was interpreted by the Soviets as a grave insult, which they used as justification to declare him persona non grata. The bug itself underwent various custodianships, being analyzed, documented, and eventually damaged during handling as curious investigators examined the thin membrane that served as its microphone. The membrane had to be replaced for the device to function in demonstrations, and at some point, the original artifact was separated from the wooden seal that had concealed it. The question of what intelligence the Soviets had actually obtained during the bug's operational period remained largely a matter of conjecture. A Soviet intelligence operative later admitted that the device had yielded crucial information regarding American diplomatic strategies during pivotal years of the Cold War, enabling Moscow to adapt its own stances with prior knowledge of Washington's probable reactions. The recorded conversations encompassed highly strategic discussions, personal evaluations of Soviet leaders, debates concerning military capacities and nuclear weapons policy, as well as candid assessments of America's inclination to challenge Soviet expansionism in various territories. The damage assessment concluded that nearly every significant policy deliberation that transpired in the ambassador's private study between 1945 and 1952 should be considered compromised. This included Marshall's deliberations during the 1947 Council of Foreign Ministers, discussions pertaining to the Berlin blockade and airlift, debates surrounding NSC-68 and the augmentation of America's military capabilities, and numerous conversations regarding intelligence operations, diplomatic strategy, and political evaluations that Moscow would have found exceedingly useful. The Soviets had effectively overheard American policymakers articulating their thoughts during the most formative decades of the Cold War, gaining insights not merely into specific decisions, but into the underlying reasoning, fears, and limitations that shaped American strategy. The full extent of this intelligence triumph would never be entirely ascertainable, but its influence on the early Cold War was undoubtedly considerable. Security protocols at American diplomatic installations underwent a thorough overhaul in response to this discovery. The State Department instituted more stringent standards for debugging operations, invested in novel detection equipment specifically engineered to identify passive resonators, and implemented rigorous procedures for handling gifts and decorative items that could potentially conceal surveillance devices. A new cohort of security personnel trained in the latest electronic intelligence methodologies was deployed to embassies worldwide with instructions to presume any space could be compromised and to verify rather than implicitly trust. The established norms of diplomatic security fundamentally shifted, moving from a somewhat gentlemanly assumption that certain conventions would be observed to a hardened acknowledgement that espionage recognized no such boundaries. The Great Seal bug remained a closely guarded secret until the spring of 1960, when international events presented an ideal opening for its revelation. On May 1, 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile downed an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers over Sverdlovsk, approximately 1,200 meters within Soviet territory. Powers, who had been executing a reconnaissance mission photographing Soviet military installations, survived the shoot-down and was apprehended, furnishing the Soviets with both a live pilot and the wreckage of one of America's most advanced intelligence collection platforms. The incident immediately triggered an international crisis, disrupting the Paris summit between President Eisenhower and Premier Khrushchev that had been scheduled for later that month, and providing Moscow with a propaganda coup as they denounced American aggression and espionage. The Soviet Union convened an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council to condemn the U-2 flights and demand international reprimand of American intelligence activities. Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko delivered a scathing address regarding American perfidy, asserting that the spy flights demonstrated Washington's hostile intentions and disregard for international law. For 3 days, Soviet diplomats persistently attacked American violations of Soviet airspace, presenting evidence of the U-2 program and demanding accountability. The Americans found themselves in an awkward predicament, unable to deny the apparent truth of the intelligence-gathering missions while simultaneously attempting to mitigate the diplomatic repercussions. It was within this context that the decision was made to disclose the Great Seal bug, offering a dramatic counterexample of Soviet espionage that could divert attention from the U-2 incident. On May 26, 1960, during the 4th day of the Security Council proceedings, United States Ambassador to the United Nations Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. took the floor and presented the wooden carving of the Great Seal. Lodge, a skilled diplomat and former senator who grasped the significance of dramatic presentation, explained to the assembled delegates and the observing global audience how Soviet schoolchildren had presented this gift to Ambassador Harriman in 1945, how it had adorned the ambassador's private study for 7 years, and how it had concealed a sophisticated listening device that permitted the Soviets to monitor America's most confidential diplomatic exchanges. He opened the seal to reveal the compartment where the bug had been installed, detailed how the passive device functioned without batteries or wires, and disclosed that American security officers had discovered over 100 concealed listening devices in embassies and residences within Soviet bloc countries in recent years. The revelation achieved its intended outcome, completely undermining the Soviet narrative of American espionage being uniquely aggressive or improper. Lodge's presentation illustrated that both superpowers engaged in extensive intelligence-gathering operations, that the Soviets had been conducting sophisticated surveillance for years, and that Moscow's indignation over the U-2 flights was fundamentally hypocritical. The Soviet delegation endeavored to dismiss Lodge's assertions as baseless, but the physical evidence of the bug and the detailed explanation of its discovery rendered denial infeasible. The Security Council voted against the Soviet resolution condemning the United States by a margin of 7-2, with only Poland siding with the Soviets. The Great Seal bug had fulfilled its propaganda objective, deflecting international criticism and exposing Soviet intelligence operations to public scrutiny. The public disclosure of the Great Seal bug fundamentally reshaped the landscape of Cold War espionage, compelling both sides to openly acknowledge what had previously been conducted covertly. The device itself became emblematic of the technological contest that defined the intelligence rivalry between the superpowers, a reminder that innovation and subterfuge were as vital as raw collection capabilities. The story of how Soviet children had presented this so-called gift, how it had evaded detection for 7 years, and how its eventual discovery necessitated new thinking about the potential of listening devices, captured the public imagination and became a cornerstone of Cold War history. The original bug, or what remained of it following various analyses and handling, ultimately came into the possession of the National Security Agency, though its precise current whereabouts remain uncertain. A faithful replica is exhibited at the National Cryptologic Museum in Fort Meade, Maryland, where visitors can examine its construction and comprehend the principles underlying its ingenious design. For Lev Terman himself, the Great Seal bug represented merely one chapter in a remarkable and tragic life that spanned the century. Following his release from the Sharashka in 1947, he continued his association with Soviet intelligence agencies, developing additional surveillance technologies that remained classified. He taught at the Moscow Conservatory, raised a family, and endured the Stalin era to witness the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union. In 1991, shortly before his passing at the age of 97, Terman journeyed to the United States where he was reunited with Clara Rockmore, the virtuoso who had championed his musical instrument and received recognition for her contributions to electronic music. The more somber aspects of his work for Soviet intelligence were acknowledged, but viewed with an understanding of the untenable circumstances under which he had operated. His invention of the passive resonator bug remained his most significant contribution to the realm of intelligence. A design so elegant that variations of it continue to influence electronic surveillance technology. The individuals involved in the Great Seal bug narrative pursued their careers in intelligence and diplomacy, carrying with them the lessons acquired from this episode. Joseph Bezyen, the security officer who ultimately found the device, continued his work in technical surveillance countermeasures, later serving in Egypt before retiring to Florida. George Kennan's diplomatic tenure was curtailed by the persona non grata incident, but he subsequently became one of the most influential historians and theoreticians of the Cold War, with his memoirs offering valuable insights into the period when the bug was active. Peter Wright's analysis of the device propelled him into an extensive career with MI5. Although his later years were marred by controversy following the publication of Spycatcher, his memoir exposing what he perceived as institutional deficiencies within British intelligence. The Great Seal bug influenced all their lives, serving as a perfect illustration of how a single technological item could impact careers, policies, and the trajectory of Cold War history. The enduring legacy of the Great Seal bug persists in museums, in intelligence training programs, in security protocols that still account for the possibility of passive surveillance devices, and in the historical record of Cold War espionage. It stands as one of the era's most successful intelligence operations, a technological triumph that provided the Soviet Union with years of invaluable diplomatic intelligence while remaining entirely undetected. Its eventual discovery and public revelation came to symbolize the concealed dimensions of superpower rivalry, the inventiveness of engineers operating under duress, and the perpetual necessity for vigilance in safeguarding sensitive communications. More than 60 years after Joseph Bézin removed the wooden seal from the wall at Spaso House, the story continues to resonate. A reminder that within the realm of intelligence, the most successful operations are frequently those concealed in plain view, that the most perilous listening devices are the ones that remain silent, and that beliefs regarding security can endure long after security itself has been eroded.